When I pushed open the courtroom door, my daughter laughed. Not a loud laugh. Not one that draws attention. Just a quiet little chuckle, the kind meant to sting without leaving a mark. My son-in-law didn't laugh at all. He turned his face away, like he didn't want anyone to see him being associated with a man dressed like me. Worn brown jacket, scuffed shoes, a straw hat clutched tight in my hands like it was the last thing I owned in this world. I stood there in the aisle and heard the whispers ripple behind me. Is he lost? He looks confused. Poor old guy. I lowered my head, not because I was ashamed, but because I needed them to believe every word of it. Because that morning, my own daughter was asking a judge to declare me legally incompetent. Hello, buddies. My name is Thomas Caldwell. I'm 69 years old. I've lived most of my life in rural Georgia, in a small wooden house surrounded by tomato plants and quiet mornings. I'm a widower. I wake up early, drink my coffee slow, and mind my own business. Or at least, that's what they want you to believe about me. If you've ever felt underestimated because of your age, stay with me. And if stories like this matter to you, the kind people don't usually say out loud, tap that subscribe button now. Not for drama, for truth. Because what happened next changed everything. I walked down the aisle slowly, letting my shoulders slump just a bit. My shoes creaked against the floor, louder than they should have been in the silence. I kept my gaze low, my hand trembling slightly as I held my hat to my chest. I'd practiced that walk at home. Emily sat at the petitioner's table on the left. My daughter, Emily Caldwell Parker, perfectly pressed navy suit, hair pinned back tight, makeup flawless. She looked like she belonged there, like she owned the room. She leaned toward her husband and whispered something. The corner of her mouth lifted. Another quiet laugh. Mark Parker sat beside her, expensive watch flashing under the courtroom lights. He didn't smile. He just looked at me with that same expression he always used lately. The one that said everything was already decided. They were certain this was going to be easy. The clerk called the case in a flat voice, like reading off a grocery list. Petition to declare Thomas Caldwell, age 69, legally incompetent. Filed by biological daughter, Emily Caldwell Parker. Every word landed heavy. Legally incompetent. I sat down at the table they'd placed me at, the one meant for people who needed decisions made for them. I rested my hands on my knees and kept my head bowed. The courtroom was fuller than usual. Not because I mattered, but because people like me don't usually end up here unless something has gone very wrong. I could feel the eyes on my back, some pity, some judgment, some already convinced I was exactly what they'd been told I was. A confused old man. The judge hadn't spoken yet. He was flipping through the file slowly. I could feel him studying me, trying to match what he saw with what he'd read. I didn't look up, not yet. Emily stood first. Her voice was calm, professional, polished. She talked about concern, about safety, about how I lived alone, about how I was isolated, about how I didn't understand complex financial matters. Mark added a few words of his own. Smooth, confident. Talking about risk, talking about protection. I let them talk. I let them paint me exactly how they needed me to look. Inside, my heart was steady, calm, almost quiet. Because while they thought this was the beginning of the end for me, I knew it was only the beginning of something else. And if you're still listening right now, do me a favor. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every one. Sometimes knowing someone's out there makes all the difference. I kept my head down a little longer, long enough for the silence to grow uncomfortable. Then I felt it. The judge stopped turning pages. His hand froze. And the air in that courtroom shifted. Not because of what he'd read, but because of who he was starting to recognize. And that's where it all truly began. The morning everything started unraveling didn't feel dramatic at all. It felt ordinary, and that's what scared me later. The sun was just coming up over the trees behind my house. Dew still clung to the tomato plants, and my chickens were already hopping around like they owned the place. I was standing in the kitchen waiting for the coffee to finish brewing when the phone rang. One sharp ring, then silence. I looked at the screen. An unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. "Hello," I said. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice I hadn't heard in years, tight and tired. "Thomas, Henry's gone." I didn't ask who it was. I already knew. My older brother, Henry Caldwell. The only family member who'd never made me feel small. I didn't sit down. I didn't speak. I just stood there watching the coffee spill over the rim of the mug like it didn't matter anymore. "They said it was his heart," the voice continued. "Neighbor found him this morning. Looks like it happened overnight." I closed my eyes. Henry had lived alone outside Atlanta. Big house, quiet life. Always said he was fine. Always said not to worry. "Did he suffer?" I asked, even though I knew the question wouldn't change anything. "They said it was quick." The call ended not long after that. No condolences, no softness. Just information delivered and done with. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at nothing for a long time. Henry was gone, and I hadn't even said goodbye. The phone rang again less than 10 minutes later. This time, I didn't need to look. "Dad," Emily said. Her voice was steady, controlled, no crack in it at all. "You heard about Uncle Henry, right?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Okay." A brief pause, then just like that she said it. "We need to talk about his estate." That word, estate. It landed wrong, too fast, too clean. "Emily," I said slowly, "your uncle just died." "I know," she replied, but her tone didn't match the words. "But there are legal timelines. Things have to be handled properly." Handled properly. She went on like she was reading from a memo. "Henry had left everything to me. The house, the land, the accounts. The total value," she said, "was just under $900,000. The number didn't move me. Henry wasn't a number." "You live alone," Emily continued. "Out in the countryside. You don't need all that, and honestly, I don't think you're equipped to manage something that complex." I felt something cold slide down my spine. "I've managed my life for nearly 70 years, I said. "I think I'll manage this too." That's when Mark's voice cut in. He hadn't even bothered to introduce himself. "With respect, sir," he said, stiff and rehearsed, "this isn't about survival, it's about risk, markets, legal exposure. These things aren't simple. Help, protection, risk." They kept using those words like shields. Emily suggested I come to the city, just to sit down, go over paperwork, get things organized. I looked around my kitchen. Everything was exactly where it belonged. "All right," I said finally. "I'll come." I drove to Atlanta 2 days later. The road felt longer than it used to, heavier. Every mile carried memories of trips I'd made with Henry, laughing about nothing, talking about everything. Emily and Mark's house sat behind black iron gates, lawn trimmed so perfectly it looked fake. Mark opened the door with a nod. No hug, no welcome. Emily gave me a quick embrace, already pulling away. "Long drive?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said. Papers were waiting on the table, stacks of them. They talked. A lot, accounts, terms, concerns. Emily explained things to me like I was a child, even though she knew better. Mark hovered behind her, watching my reactions. Then he leaned forward and said it. "This stuff is complicated. You don't want to get taken advantage of." I looked at him. "You think I would?" "It's not personal," he replied. "It's probability." Emily slid a folder toward me. "It's just temporary, power of attorney so we can help." I opened it. I didn't need long, full control, not temporary, not help. I closed the folder and pushed it back. "I'm not signing." The room went quiet. Emily's smile stiffened. Mark's eyes hardened. "You should read it more carefully," Emily said. "I understand it perfectly," I replied. "And the answer is no." That's when I saw it, not concern, not worry, calculation. And in that moment, sitting in my own daughter's living room, I understood something I never wanted to believe. Henry's death didn't just leave me money. It put a target on my back. If you're still with me right now, stay close. And if you've ever felt pressure dressed up as love, let me know in the comments. You'd be surprised how many people think they're alone until they hear a story like this. Because that night, while I lay awake in a house that wasn't mine, I learned exactly how far they were willing to go. And it was farther than I ever imagined. That night, I didn't sleep. The guest room was spotless, quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt monitored, like even the walls were listening. I lay on my back staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, replaying every word from the afternoon. Not the loud ones, the small ones. The way Emily said temporary when the papers clearly weren't. The way Mark talked about risk like it was a threat instead of a concern. The way they looked at each other when I said no. Sometime after midnight, my throat went dry. I got up quietly, slipped on my sandals, and opened the door. The hallway lights were off, but a dim glow leaked in from the living room downstairs. I stepped onto the first stair. That's when I heard their voices. Emily's first. Low, fast, stripped of that careful tone she used with me. "He wouldn't sign," she said. "I told you he wouldn't hand over control willingly." I stopped moving. Mark answered without hesitation. "That doesn't matter anymore. We have another option." My hand tightened around the railing. "I don't want to take it that far," Emily said. There was a pause, not guilt, just strategy. "He's still my father." Mark let out a short laugh. "Emily, you're a lawyer. You know how this works. He's old. He lives alone, isolated. That's all we need." I felt the word old hit harder than I expected. "We can file for guardianship," Mark continued. "Legally incompetent. Court-appointed control. Once it's done, he can't object to anything." There it was, out in the open, clean, calm, planned. "But what if people question it?" Emily asked. "They won't," Mark said. "We've already started laying the groundwork. Medical records, lifestyle, witness statements. The more helpless he looks, the stronger the case." I closed my eyes. They weren't improvising. This wasn't anger. This was preparation. "Are the attorneys ready?" Emily asked. "Yes," Mark replied. "One specializes in these cases. We've also got a private investigator collecting information. Neighbors, daily habits, anything that paints the picture we need." Picture we need. I heard Emily exhale slowly. Then she said the sentence that settled everything inside me. "Then do it. Just do it fast. I don't want him getting suspicious." I stood there frozen, the words sinking in one by one, not because they hurt, but because they clarified. The daughter I raised wasn't being misled. She had chosen. I went back to the room without making a sound, closed the door softly, sat on the edge of the bed with my hands on my knees. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I felt something worse, empty. When people you love stop seeing you as human and start seeing you as a problem to solve, something breaks quietly inside. Before sunrise, I packed my bag. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain. I drove out of that neighborhood while the streetlights were still on, the sky just beginning to pale. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't speed. I just drove. By the time I reached my little wooden house, the sun was rising. The land looked the same as always. Calm. Honest. I brewed coffee and sat on the porch, holding the warm mug with both hands. And for the first time since Henry died, I let myself think clearly. They thought I would panic. They thought I would argue. They thought fear would make me sloppy. They were wrong. Because if there's one thing life teaches you by the time you reach my age, It's that silence can be a weapon when used correctly. If you're listening right now, and someone has ever tried to take control of your life for your own good, stay with me. And if this story is hitting close to home, tap that like button. It helps more people hear stories like this, the ones that warn before it's too late. By the time Emily and Mark woke up that morning, I was already preparing something they never saw coming. When I pulled into my driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires sounded louder than usual. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. I sat there for a long moment before turning off the engine. The porch light was still on. I must have forgotten to switch it off when I left. Funny how small habits stay, even when everything else falls apart. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and old wood. Familiar. Honest. I set my bag down and stood in the middle of the room, feeling the quiet settle around me. That's when I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to ask in years. Who was I before they decided I was weak? I went into the small study at the back of the house. Most people wouldn't look twice at it. Just an old desk, a worn chair, a filing cabinet I hadn't opened in a long time. I opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thin wooden box. No lock. Never needed one. I lifted the lid and took out a single envelope, yellowed with age. My brother Henry's handwriting stared back at me, careful, deliberate, the way he wrote when something mattered. I sat down slowly and opened it. The letter wasn't long. Henry wrote that he'd left everything to me not because I was family, but because he trusted me to never let what he built be turned into a tool for greed. He said he'd noticed people asking questions long before his death. Too many questions, too precise, questions that didn't sound like concern. He warned me not to be surprised if things turned ugly after he was gone. "You've always known how to stand your ground," he wrote, "even when it costs you." I folded the letter and placed it on the desk. That was when the memories came back, not all at once, slowly, like an old door opening. The courtroom, the bench, the weight of silence before a verdict. I hadn't always lived quietly in the countryside. For 35 years I wore a black robe and sat where decisions changed lives. I wasn't the loud kind of judge. I didn't lecture. I listened. I watched. I waited. I learned early that confidence makes people careless, and patience makes truth surface. I stepped away from that life after my wife died, not because I was tired of justice, but because I was tired of loss. I wanted soil under my hands instead of files, sunrises instead of gavels. I thought I'd closed that chapter. But sitting there in that chair, Henry's letter in front of me, I understood something clearly. You don't stop being who you are just because you stop wearing the uniform. I picked up the phone and stared at the number saved under a name I hadn't dialed in years. Margaret Lewis. She had been my secretary for nearly 2 decades. Knew how I thought. Knew how the system bent when people pushed too hard. The phone rang twice. Then her voice, older, still sharp. "Well," she said softly, "I was wondering when you'd call." We met that afternoon at my kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee, no small talk. I told her everything. The papers, the overheard conversation, the guardianship plan. She listened without interrupting. Then she said the sentence that shaped everything that followed. "If you fight them head-on, they'll paint you as unstable, but if you let them believe they're winning, they'll get careless." I nodded. That night the plan became simple. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't warn them. I wouldn't reveal anything. I would become exactly who they thought I was. A slow old man. Confused. Outmatched. Because the most dangerous mistake powerful people make is underestimating someone who has nothing left to prove. If you've ever been mistaken for weak when you were simply quiet, you already understand what I'm saying. And if you're still here, don't forget to subscribe. These stories aren't about revenge. They're about seeing clearly before it's too late. By the time Emily filed the petition, every piece was already moving, and all I had to do next was walk back into their courtroom. The day of the hearing arrived without ceremony. No storm, no warning sign, just a pale morning sky and the quiet weight of inevitability. I dressed slowly, choosing the clothes they expected: faded shirt, worn slacks, shoes scuffed at the heel. I held the straw hat in my hands and studied it for a moment before leaving, not because it mattered, but because symbols do. Margaret was already waiting in the parking lot near the courthouse when I arrived. We didn't hug. We didn't speak much. She just gave me a small nod, the kind people give when everything that needs to be said already has been. Inside, the courtroom buzzed softly. Low conversations, papers shuffling, a few curious glances my way. I kept my eyes down and walked carefully, like each step required effort. Emily and Mark were already seated. Emily looked composed, confident, the kind of confidence people wear when they believe the outcome is guaranteed. Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, scanning the room like a man who owned it. I sat where they told me to sit, placed my hat on my lap, let my hands shake just enough to be noticed. The clerk called the case. Emily's attorney stood and began speaking smoothly, laying out the narrative they had carefully built. My age, my isolation, my declining ability to manage complex matters. He used words like concern and protection the way one uses seasoning, lightly but intentionally. Emily nodded at the right moments. Mark whispered something to the lawyer and smirked. I didn't react. The attorney referenced selective medical notes, short prescriptions, long gaps between social interactions, everything framed to suggest deterioration without ever saying it outright. The room absorbed it. People believed it. That's when the side door opened. The judge entered. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe age had just changed my perspective. His robe settled as he took his seat. He opened the file and began reading without looking up. Routine. Mechanical, then a pause. He flipped a page back, looked again. His eyes lifted briefly, landed on me, then dropped back to the file. Something tightened in his posture. He cleared his throat. Emily's lawyer continued, confident, unaware of the shift. The judge looked up again, this time longer. His gaze traced my face, my posture, my hands. I kept my head lowered. I could feel the moment stretching. Confusion flickered across his expression. Not dramatic, subtle, like a memory brushing against the edge of recognition. He pressed his lips together and looked back down. I heard someone in the gallery whisper. The judge leaned back slightly, then forward again. He was no longer just reading. He was remembering. And for the first time since this began, I sensed uncertainty ripple across the room. Mark noticed it too. He leaned forward now, his jaw tightening. Emily's smile wavered for just a fraction of a second. The judge turned one more page, then stopped. He looked directly at me, not at the file. At me. Mr. Caldwell, he said slowly. I waited, let the silence breathe. Yes, Your Honor, I replied, my voice thin, almost unsure. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with disbelief. He stood halfway from his chair, then stopped himself. The room held its breath. And in that instant, I knew the careful balance they had built was starting to crack. The judge didn't sit back down right away. He stared at me as if the file in front of him no longer made sense. Like two pictures that refused to line up no matter how hard he tried. Mr. Caldwell, he said again, slower this time. How long have you lived in rural Georgia? I hesitated. Just a beat too long, on purpose. Oh, some years now, I said softly. After my wife passed. A few people in the room shifted. Sympathy always comes easy when the story sounds familiar. The judge nodded, but his eyes never left my face. Not the polite nod of acknowledgement, the searching kind, like a man standing in a doorway trying to remember what room he's been in before. Emily's lawyer stepped in quickly, sensing the pause. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "the petitioner would like to emphasize." "Just a moment," the judge interrupted, raising a hand. That hand didn't shake. It didn't hesitate. The courtroom went quiet in a way that felt different than before. Not bored, not curious. Alert. The judge stood up fully now and took a step closer to the bench, leaning forward. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "would you mind looking up at me?" Emily's breath caught. I heard it clearly. I lifted my head slowly, not all the way, just enough. Our eyes met. The color drained from his face. He took a step back as if the floor had shifted under him. "No," he whispered, not into the microphone, not for the room, just to himself. "That can't be." A murmur spread instantly. Chairs creaked. Someone gasped. Mark shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Sit down," the judge said sharply. The command cut through the room like a blade. Mark froze, then sat. The judge stepped down from the bench. One step, then another. Coming closer, his voice lowered, almost reverent now. "You once told a young clerk," he said carefully, "that confidence makes liars careless, and patience makes the truth surface." I straightened my back, just a little. "That clerk," I said, my voice steady now, "used to sit in the back row on the left. Courtroom 3. The room exploded into whispers. Emily turned fully toward me now, her face pale, eyes wide, shaking her head slowly like she could undo the moment by refusing to believe it. The judge closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "You were a judge," he said, not a question, a realization. "Yes," I replied, 35 years. The silence that followed was heavy, final. Emily's lawyer stammered. "Your Honor, this information was not disclosed in the filing." "Exactly," the judge snapped. "And that omission is deeply troubling." Mark stood again. "This has nothing to do with the case." "It has everything to do with it," the judge said coldly. "Sit down." Mark's confidence collapsed right there, not loudly, just gone. The judge turned back to me. "Do you wish to represent yourself as noted in the supplemental filing submitted this morning?" "I do," I said. Margaret stood from the back row and walked forward, placing her old leather briefcase on the table. She didn't rush. She didn't look at Emily or Mark. She didn't need to. I spoke calmly. "I'm not here to prove I'm perfect," I said. "I'm here to prove I'm capable of deciding my own life." Margaret opened the briefcase. The first file slid onto the table. "Complete medical records," I continued, "not selective excerpts, including physician notes stating no cognitive impairment." Emily's lawyer opened his mouth, closed it. The second item followed. "An audio recording," I said, turning toward my daughter for the first time. Her hands clenched together. She knew the recording played. Her voice filled the room. Clear, controlled, talking about strategy, about speed, about ensuring control. When it ended, no one spoke, not even Emily. Mark stood abruptly. "This is a family matter," he said loudly. "This recording proves nothing." I looked at him calmly. "Then the third document will." Margaret placed the file down gently. "Real estate transactions, shell companies, old case numbers." Mark's face changed. Not anger, fear. The judge didn't need me to explain. He had already begun reading. Minutes passed. Then he looked up. "The court finds," he said slowly, "that the petition to declare Thomas Caldwell legally incompetent fails to meet the required standard of proof." Emily collapsed back into her chair. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "evidence presented today indicates potential legal violations. This matter will be referred for further investigation." Mark didn't say a word. He just turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with a hollow sound. Emily remained seated, trembling. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "I thought control would keep everything from falling apart." I didn't answer. Some truths don't need response. The judge struck the gavel once. The case was over, but the cost of it was only beginning to sink in. When the courtroom finally emptied, the silence felt heavier than any verdict I'd ever heard. People filed past me quietly. Some avoided my eyes. Some nodded with respect. A few looked shaken, like they just watched a story they didn't expect unfold in real life. Margaret rested a gentle hand on my shoulder. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't need to. We both knew this wasn't a victory. Emily was still seated when I turned around. My daughter looked smaller somehow. Not weak, just exposed. Like the armor she'd been wearing for years had finally cracked, and she didn't know what to put on underneath. "I really believed I was doing the right thing," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I was so afraid of losing control, of ending up with nothing." I looked at her for a long moment. "I raised you to stand on your own feet," I said, "not to stand on someone else's neck." She nodded, tears slipping down without resistance. There was no argument left in her, no strategy, just regret. We didn't hug, not because I didn't love her, but because some wounds need space before they can close. I walked out of that courthouse alone. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Not because the danger was gone, but because the truth no longer had to hide. I didn't go straight home. I drove through parts of the city I hadn't seen in years. Old streets, familiar corners, places where I'd once carried the weight of other people's lives in my decisions. I parked near a small cafe and sat by the window watching strangers walk past, each one carrying their own unseen battles. Henry's words echoed in my mind. A legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're here. Nearly $900,000 sat quietly in accounts with my name on them now. Money that could have bought comfort, ease, silence. But silence had already cost me enough. In the months that followed, I made a different choice. I met with young attorneys who still believed the law was meant to protect, not exploit. I listened to families caught in guardianship nightmares. Elderly men and women who were treated like problems instead of people. So we opened a small legal aid office. Nothing flashy. No signs screaming for attention. Just a place where someone could walk in and ask a question without fear of being judged or stripped of their dignity. Most of Henry's money went there. Every dollar accounted for. Every decision transparent. Letters started arriving.